Hi there, Randy Green here, podcast number 2. Podcast number 1 was how can past lives teach us about the now or who we are in the present? And I know I didn't give any answers there because that was just the working title for, I could have called it introduction, right? But that was the understanding what I want to work with here. And that's what I'm going to call the playlist. So here in podcast number 2, I want to kind of lay the foundation of how can we access these past lives, parallel lives, similar lives, other reality lives, alternate reality lives, whatever we want to call it, because I think we are operating on a scale. I think there are past lives. I do think there are certain dynamics of recirculation of consciousness potentials and energy systems that are pulled in and out of storage and are connected to different physical forms. I do have that as a basic understanding, and I want to touch ground a little bit why do I have that, right? And then not from a basic of studies of Hindu text or other ideas of reincarnation, because there are different. I remember years ago when I was younger, there were these programs of kids that remembered past lives in India and other places. And you can say because it's culturally accepted that there is past life, then it's okay to talk about it. Whereas here in the northern world where we don't really accept past lives, well, then if a kid comes and begins to talk a different language or whatever, we will begin to think, oh, what's the pathological issue to that one? Is there mental breakdown or whatever? We approach it differently because it's not part of our culture. Of course, within spiritual communities and others that are working with other levels of reality, then that's a given, including when we have, for instance, just talk about Mozart, right? He was already writing music at an age of 4. How's that even possible, right? So we have these kind of incidents in our Western culture as well, where we kind of have to scratch our head and try to pretend it's not odd and try to pretend it's natural, as in, 4-year-old, right? Very high-leveled type of music. Yes, his dad was teaching him since he was 2 or whatever, but still from being taught to play piano to become this enormously talented writer of music in an age of 4 or 5. Can't remember. You can look it up yourself on Mozart. And in that understanding is similar at other kids that are in age of 10 or 11 know how to create plasma coils or quantum computers and what have you. Where does that come from? Or just Nikola Tesla that had a vision of how to create different new types of, instead of having the analog, the Edison model of how to light up a light bulb, and he came with this dual kind of dipole energy currents instead, and how that could, without noise, also produce the same amount of energy, and onward and so forth. The circuitry which we are now using today as part of our electric devices. Where does these come from? So we are here talking. That's kind of the question I asked myself as well when I wanted to do my bachelor, the final thesis in my bachelor degree in theology. I actually wanted to work with Teresa of Avila and some of her visions and what she had interpreted that as explained in her biography, how she had physical symptoms like Francis of Assisi that also had physical stigmata, as it's called, bleeding wounds. Where does that come from? And then science will say, well, it's just because they kind of get so hyped up, to put it that way, in a little bit paraphrasing the more the science lingo, but you kind of you psych yourself up to such a degree that you actually can create physical effects of it. And they'll say, well, that's probably, we have seen that in different forms and levels. That's possible. We have also seen weird stuff with humans that have what we call multiple personality structures, where they almost kind of one version of them have a weird skin disease. The other version doesn't have the skin disease, but it's the same human form. How's that even possible? Ask these weird questions. Is it because there are actually 2 forms in one form? Let's work a little bit outside the box when we begin to look at this. And that's where science says, oh no, that's too outlandish. That's fringe. That's not science. That is not evidence-based. You can't claim this. Or say, well, can you claim any of your ideas and theories to be more accurate then, other than they are within your paradigm of understanding? So what's the difference? I have a different paradigm of understanding. What makes my paradigm of understanding less worthy than your paradigm of understanding, right? So this is where we also need to work with information as different information systems and be open to different interpretation of information and not just work within the narrowed down, accepted ideas of what reality is and what reality isn't. And my claim is, and I know I often get unpopular with that one, but when we talk general sciences, first and foremost, it is an enormously slowly operating apparatus, right? It has changed the later years due to the matrix of change and other intuitive reality programs that has pushed the psychodynamics and the bureaucracy and the way that we work inside our reality to a large degree. Also because the Old World Order program broke down in 2016, allowing for what we call multidimensional influx that were more quantum-based, and by that work with more with probabilities and possibilities. And then it goes into the amplification factor, and it goes into what we call momentum of energy that pushes a current timeline into a different kind of trajectory from where it will unfold its content, which is what a matrix of change is. So you play in different factors that will then amplify the vector or the movement in time from where change can happen. So that's part of the matrix of change. And you can get the course material for free on the Higher Order Systemic Energetic Awareness Forum, or just whole Systemic Awareness Forum, as I call it on my website, because the whole Higher Order Systemic Energetic Awareness Forum was a little bit too long for the headline of my website. So on randygreen.one, I'll put link below here so you can get access to that, so you can learn some of these very alternate reality sciences that are already been implemented. It's not just fringe. I love that TV show, by the way. That was one of the ones I really enjoyed, because there it was like, finally someone is actually working with this from a scientific level. And of course, it's not really accessible anymore, other than those of you who were lucky enough to buy it on DVD and got that one. But I enjoyed it, aside from the end of it that I didn't enjoy so much. But that's how it often goes. It begins in a good place, and then anyways, we'll just leave that one, because this is not about TV shows, although that we have a lot of different information that are given to us via TV shows, and more so as we move into what we call a higher level of connection between virtual reality, quantum computer, and the way that different forms of sound and light media, such as movies and that are streamed on the internet, will affect the collective in different ways than it has before, which is not only just because people are watching it, but also due to interception technology, as well as how these sound and light waves can alter the reality itself because of the new reality programs that are being implemented. And that is, of course, done by extra systemic races outside of our little enclosure here, our little Truman Show, which is the big plot to change that one into being able to adapt and open up to the other civilizations that actually exist around us, but in a different type of energy and not frequency, the frequency spectrum enclosure that we are currently part of, and thereby cannot see anything else that what is presented to us within the frequency spectrum. Visible light. Remember, your eyes can only detect visible light. So that's the five senses. They are limited by the frequency spectrum within a very narrowed band of the entire frequency spectrum. But that does not mean the other dimensions are frequency based. They are not. They're based upon what's called holographic radiation vibration or holographic light wave, sound wave features. So this is something different. It works in a different way, but that's not what I want to talk about here. Okay. So where did I get the idea of past lives? Well, let me put it this way. As a child, I had many interesting dreams. I have used some of the dreams in other podcasts and in other material where the other dreams fit in. Here, I want to focus on one specific dream, a reoccurring dream that kept coming back. And that's the dream of being born. And that's one of my nightmares because it was a terrifying experience. The whole feeling of being in some kind of, perhaps in the womb of my mom, that would be my best guess. Or as I also play a little bit with, because even though we might see the as if it appears there is a child there, and I've been pregnant myself, which was one of the most outlandish experience I ever had, having another living being in your womb. That was the most weird thing. And I could not switch into, oh, this is beautiful kind of thing, because I'm a different kind of material. So I was really feeling as if I was Sigourney Weaver, part of the movie Aliens. So that was a different approach. But when the little one came out, I was more than happy to take on that project and do what I needed to do, and have grown my offspring off to be a very functional and highly doable human being inside this reality. So that's definitely something I'm proud of, and can be satisfied with having done what I could there as a parent, as a single parent, actually. But aside from that, as a child, I used to have this dream where I am in some other state. I'm not going to classify it as in the womb or not in the womb, because the question is, especially now, perhaps not back then in the 60s, but in the 70s, because I'm born in 68. So we're here talking the 70s, around age 7, 8 or 9 or something like that. I had this reoccurring dream that almost came back at least 2 or 3 times a month. And I always woke up very terrified, because I was in this alternate state of bliss. And there are 2 opportunities here. One is that alternate state of bliss was in the womb of my mom. I have done a little bit of psychology course with prenatal experiences as part of expanded awareness, often conducted via the use of LSD. Not that I have done LSD, but these trials or these experiments were done in the 70s and 80s using LSD, where they were working with the prenatal experience before birth, right? And being in the womb was this heavenly realm where you were floating around, everything was good and fine, you were safe and you felt good. And I can say, well, probably not, because my mom was a high-stress being. She was semi-depressive. She had a little tendency towards alcoholism, and she was always arguing with my father, and she was not happy in her marriage. So no, I wouldn't say in the conditions of being this in this floating bliss sphere. Even though she loved being pregnant, I felt that definitely. She loved me already before I was born. I felt that definitely. She was, to the best of her abilities, a caring mother. The problem was not until the age of 5. The problem was after that, because she was, psychologically speaking, in many ways not really an adult, to put it that way. So when it came to the more difficult parts of being a mentor for a child that were to grow into adulthood, there she kind of had her flaws. But she's very good with little children, though, because that's kind of the doll dream, right? Working with the little infant as this little innocent being that you can take care of and dress up as you like. But aside from that one, I know this is probably not how she would portray herself. But for the sake of my understanding of my mother, as in kind of, yes, caring until a certain age, and then due to the divorce from my father, the family situation and what have you, not so good a mother, and actually left me with a lot of abandonment issues, including having to pick her up at bars and get her back home, and all of her acting out while after the divorce, and her depression and her semi-alcoholism that grew into larger potentials and larger scales, and all of these difficulties that came with that. So, including having a childhood where I kind of discovered that my mom was drinking because she had gin in her closet, and all of these secrecies there are with this kind of having an addiction and not sharing it with others, and my father not understanding why they always had to argue, and why there was always trouble, and why she was doing what she was doing, and not really connecting it to the fact that she was drinking, and that affected her frontal lobe system and brought her into the limbic system, from where she was just acting out instead of being what we call a knowledgeable, considerate female. So also imbued with different types of depressive tendencies. And I understand this due to her childhood and my family setting, and runs in the family and what have you. So all going back to my grandmother, which her mother left her tied up to a chair or a table leg while in that was in 1914, 15, 16 or something, and where the mother took off and left the child behind, so that when the father came home to my grandmother, she was sitting there in her own feces and crying and had been crying for hours. So that's not the best way to become kind of foundationally have a balanced psyche, right? So anyway, so we have all of us in our families have different sorts of traumas, different sorts of incidents that have tailored us, that has formed us, that has created our structural layers, the way we perceive reality, the level of anxiety, and onward and so forth. So these are the psychodynamics that everyone has. There are different variations of it. Some are more traumatic than others, but all of the experiences we have from our parents, from our childhood experiences, from others, from school, every situation we have been in are part of forming who we are. They're part of the structural layers of our brain, and how we perceive that depends on our genetics and our electrochemical processes when we are put into different situations. And that's the interesting part I want to work with, because that is defined, as I see it, to a large degree, not only by what we get from our parents and as in prenatal state in the mom's womb, right? Because we know that affects the child as part of epigenetics. There have been, with the 9/11 incident, it has shown that the females that were close to the incident, or actually survived the incident, if they were pregnant, there has been some really significant changes in the stress level in the offspring. It was kind of transferred from the mother to the child. It changed the receptors. It changed what was switched on and off of the RNA and what was switched on and off in the DNA by that stress factor that the mothers had undergone, although it was what we call a short period event, but it was a very traumatic one, and they raised up their stress level to such a degree, including what we call the PTSD afterwards, that then affected the child and created a different type of neurological structure and a sensitivity towards stress and a sensitivity to a higher level of fear, which we're also seeing in other incidents around the human population in the Western world, so to speak, where these surveys and investigations have been done. You can look up on YouTube, look up epigenetics, 9/11, some of these what do you call it? I forgot what they're called in English, because that's not where I want to go. So go back to my dream here. So was it that floating around state? It felt like, as I recall it, this kind of dark room. And if you're inside the womb of your mom, you can actually see light, you can hear sounds, but this was just some kind of dark, kind of empty space, but it felt nice. And I would say almost as in kind of, I might as well just have been floating around as an energetic orb in some kind of container. That would have been equally as well as a kind of if you say consciousness potentials in an orb of energy that were floating around in a cylinder or something, that were protected and were created via different forms of sound waves or different forms of vibrational waves, creating that environment of this is safe, this is secured, this is contained. I'm not in danger here. I'm just me. I'm just floating around in this weird space of nothingness, right? So that could equally be so, even though you say, well, the infant in the womb of the mom, the children have closed eyes, but they are hearing, they are sensing, they are definitely sensing. Those of you who have been pregnant, you know that if you're upset, you have a little footballer inside your stomach that is turning around with, as a little twisting whirlpool of something, and all the different, if you eat something, it affects the child as well. So there is definitely a complete interconnection between the child and the mother and the sounds and what's going on there. So we know that from science today as well. So therefore I could say, well, that's probably not where it were. But either way, the whole, at that point, that's where the dream begins every single time. And then it goes into that moment before birth. And I recall this is interesting because if I recall myself as that being in the moment of birth, I did not feel like a child. I actually felt like a grown up, which is interesting in itself, because how does a child know what it means to be a grown up, right? But that kind of different type of understanding of reality that grown-ups have, which children don't have. So that was the interesting part of that one, as in okay, I have this grown-up approach to what's going on, seeing things, perceiving things in a more scientific manner, to put it that way, whereas a child would experience that more emotionally. And there were emotions, but not, as in kind of if you compare the child's perception of reality and the grown-up perception of reality, because the child has not got the frontal lobes, they have not kicked in yet. That kicks in around the age of 13. So you have that whole, the child is under the limbic instinctual level, so everything is perceived via emotional reactions that are then interpreted in a kind of a little bit distorted way, we could say it that way, because the child hasn't got the full perception of what's going on, but are seeing things or hearing things and trying to understand it if the parents are not good at explaining what's going on, right? So the child has to interpret it herself or himself, and sometimes that becomes monsters or shadows or shadow beings or whatever, all depending on how vivid imagination the child has. But it could actually also be there are shadow beings, that there are monsters, and these kind of things, all depending on what type of clairvoyant abilities the child has. So it depends on, are we talking a normal child, one of the masters that has what we call normal human awareness, or are we talking a child that is already from birth having the higher order senses switched on, and by that are perceiving other levels of reality, which I was such a kid. I already had quite a lot of my higher order senses switched on already as a child, which meant I perceived reality in a more advanced way, which were a huge burden to bear. Because as a 5-year-old, you're not allowed to talk about how a grown-up feels, and your brain is not ready to decipher that level of information, because it's still in the limbic system, the base layers of it, close to the instinctual level where the needs are very simple. So that whole kind of not having a grown-up that could adjust these interpretations into what they were, just to put that in other contexts with some of the children I've been working with that have these higher order senses switched on. They're already telepathic as children. Actually, in the first 3 or 4 or 5 months, you can work with the entity or the being or the future human or the enhanced human or the hybrid human or whatever we're dealing with that are part of that organism, that part of that organic vessel, and telepathically get their history and what they're there to do and the sciences and what their mission is and all these kind of things. And you're not speaking a word with the child at all, but that you suddenly have that infant that's not supposed to mimic that way. They're not supposed to keep that focus that way. They're not supposed to operate that way in that short moment where there is a telepathic contact, are then operating from a different structural layer of the brain, which then unfortunately later gets shut down and then pushed out due to some of the prohibiting technologies we have inside this reality field, which is a little bit sad though, because our human civilizations would probably be better for it if these kids were allowed to blossom in an early age and become what they are supposed to become inside this reality. But that's not the world we live in. So with this kind of being in me and my dream, being in that state of feeling safe and secured and having that, that good sense of this is a good place to be, and then have that abrupt shift where I don't know if it's that moment where I actually enter into the body or it's the moment of birth. But the point of that one is that from being in that calm state, I go into what we call a state of panic, where I'm kind of seeing at kind of this dark tunnel at the end of there's light. And it's a very, very narrow little light. And I feel humongous compared to that little tunnel output there that little gate I'm supposed to get out of. And I feel bigger than that. And I feel that my head's getting squeezed, and I feel that my body is too big, and I'm getting kind of claustrophobic. And I'm thinking, this is never going to happen. I cannot get through that hole. And then that interesting kind of having to go over I think it's actually the pelvis, that feeling of going over that one before I get out, and then just being torpedoed out, because my mom told me that I was literally I just came out like shut out of her. But that panic I felt, that was the dream that kept recurring again and again, that feeling I cannot get through that. That's impossible. This body cannot go through that tiny hole there. And that panic, I'm going to be crushed, feeling my head was being really pressure on my head. And that kind of feeling of this is claustrophobic, which I had a huge of as a child as well. I was not the child you could put under a bed or something. I would get claustrophobic and I would get into complete panic because I couldn't breathe, as in kind of reliving my birth canal experience. So that's the interesting thing about that dream, as in kind of, how could that be? How could I have that as a recurring dream? And remember, that was in the 70s. So we did not have all sorts of fancy internet and TV shows and what have you. That was in the 70s. We barely had that book where they were taking pictures of a child inside a womb that came later on, how a child is born. I think it's called, that's the Danish translation into English. Can't remember what's called in its English version. But so there wasn't all of these, what we could call extra information systems that could plant ideas in my brain. That was simply not there. So therefore, we could say, well, at least for when we talk about children today, that suddenly begins to talk about extraterrestrials. Are they really in contact with extraterrestrials, or have they just watched the cartoon show, right? Because cartoons today hold extraterrestrials. You have children programs with extraterrestrials. You have extraterrestrials on the internet. All kids are now almost combined and interfacing directly with an iPod before an iPad or what have you before the age of 3, right? So they can get a lot of information from whatever. And that does not mean that they are, these kids, they are in contact with this or that or whatever. Because how can we verify where they have got their information from? Of course, via conversation, as you are listening to this one and saying, wow, there's a lot of coherence in that information. There's a lot of information that's not out there. There's a lot of information that are put together in a different way. And by that, you can say, well, she speaks with authority. And that's how it's put, where you kind of say, well, there are these kids that have knowledge you can't find on the internet, that have knowledge that are so coherent and so extraordinary that you have to take it face value. You can't just dismiss it and say, oh, it's made up, because it has, for instance, if you have a child that talks about, for instance, plate and crafts, how they are engineered, as some of the information I got as well, how to operate in a plate and craft. Where do I know that from, right? Kind of seeing myself inside that craft, know how to put my hands on the console, how to work with that one, how to holographically put my hands in there. And here is well, are you in a human body? Yes, I'm definitely in a human body. Do you look human? Oh yeah, definitely look human. I got blonde hair. So that's interesting. Have you been a Nordic or what? So again, so these are the weird experiences and these kind of futuristic technologies where simulations are run, where they are interactive simulations, not as in kind of put on a goggles and then you look into something we have here, but actually complete reality sessions, as we also had seen in I think it's the movie that's called The Ender's Game. I think that's called that one, where they run with some of these simulations. Kind of, whoa, that's interesting. That's one of the recall memories I have, where I am in that same type of technology long before the movie was made. So there are things where we kind of say, okay, where does that come from? Where does that elaborate level of technology information system come from? So with that perception of being, yes, human, blonde haired, but not human. So where does that come from? Right? So with that one, including understanding the whole properties of the plate and crafts, as being able to do dimensional shift, being able to go through different, what we call hypergates, that are I saw some of the similar ideas in, I think it was was it that TV show called Andromeda? I can't remember. This is again, we say, it would be nice if you remember the references you were doing. Yeah, I completely agree. But I never really know what I'm going to talk about when I begin talking. So I can't look it up beforehand, because this is my brain that are putting together the pattern and are drawing in the information needed to explain these dynamics for you. So it picks what is relevant for the explanations. And I never know beforehand when I begin making my podcast. So I can't look it up and research it beforehand. So anyways, it doesn't matter much. At the end of the day, there's been made a lot of movies. Point being here is that I had these experiences before the movies came out, and I recognized the sciences and the technologies in the movies when they came out, and not the other way around. Because then you could say, well, you saw the movie, so therefore your brain just stored that information and then used it when you got in contact with a specific type of energy or memory and what have you, and then concocted something out of what you've seen in movies and read in books and these kind of things, which science often will tell us. And this is where I kind of seem a little bit as fortunate, being in that enormously boring childhood where you had no entertainment whatsoever other than books. and there was only television started at 6 o'clock at night and it ran until 12 o'clock, and that was it. And then there was the children's program from 6 to 7, and then it was the news, and there was all that grown-up boring kind of programs that ran. And I was mostly entertained with, on Saturdays, I was watching the old Hollywood movies, musicals. That was the entertainment I had, right? So just to put that in context as well. So with that understanding, that kind of gives, okay, remembering being born, definitely. It's not just a dream. It's not something subconscious material my mind has made up because I had some kind of weird childhood trauma. Because what's the connection point between being born and then you can say, well, psychologically speaking, you could say, well, I was in this stressful family dynamics. My mom and dad were not happy. They were always arguing. We had moved from Jutland to Zealand. Things were not going well. I had been taken away from a school I was actually quite pleased with being in. I had a quite secure childhood, growing up in Jutland. I was born on Zealand, but we moved there. The environment was different. I was left much to myself there as well, but I had my garden. I had my butterflies. It was safe. It was good. And then we moved back to Zealand and I got into this class, this primary school with a lot of bullies, and I was bullied and I was insecure and I didn't feel comfortable there. My mom and dad were arguing. We had money issues. I was always in the same clothes and I was bullied for it because the other kids had more money and all these kind of things. You can say, well, that's why I had this kind of, the previous state I was in was this great, safe environment. Suddenly I'm being pushed into this rough reality where I don't fit, where I feel wrongly placed and what have you. You can make a kind of scenario of that one if you want to interpret it in that way. But that's not how I experienced that again and again in these nightmares. It felt like being born. And you can say, well, we can make a kind of psychological transfer and saying that's a kind of symbolic representation of being born into a new environment, blah, 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 blah. But that's not how I see that. For me, that feels unauthentic and far-fetched. It feels a little bit, oh yes, let's try and find a logical explanation for something that's straightforward. Why not just take it literally and say, that's the dream, and that's the dream of being reborn, so to speak, being born again or being born, and have that as a memory. Why is that not possible? Why is it not possible that a child has a prenatal experience of being born? And that's why I refer to these LSD trials. And you say, well, it's because they were high on LSD that they had all of this made up. But there are actually people that experienced their birth and remember their birth. I met other people that talks about remembering their birth, and no, they have not been on DMT and all sorts of ayahuasca and what have you. They just have a memory of it. So that's what I want to put this on the table as in kind of, you are aware before you're born. And you are very much aware the first time of your life, even though your body is not functional. As I see it with these new little children that are trying to get control of the physical form, how the brain unfolds different sequences that allows them to take control of the physical form. And if the older the personality structure that isn't that child is, and I'm deliberately not saying the older the soul is, which would be good, but then soul is connected to God and is connected to some kind of angelic realm or what have you, rebirth of souls or what have you. I'm not going to go there, but whatever's in that child, whatever original personality matrix that are connected to some kind of other dimensional feature of an existence or a personality matrix as a part of an energy system, which we can redefine as a dimensional bioform that is then capable of entering into difficult matter states that we here in our side in the enclosure sees as a more solidified crystalline version of energy. Are able to enter into that. We can talk about Michael Newton's material in that connection and say, well, that it's also expressed how these orbs are connecting to the center of the brain and by that integrate itself into the host, which is mentioned there, which for me sounds as in kind of, that's not okay, that you kind of have some kind of extra dimensional, extraterrestrial existence that claims to be the soul, but the soul, by the way, tells that this is the host body and the host already has a personality, so they create a symbiosis and merge with the already existing personality matrix. That's not okay. That's invasion of another body, isn't it? Just to put that in context as well. And I remember when I read Michael Newton's books, Destiny of Souls and so the In Between Lives, or whatever it's called, you can look them up yourself, and they're from the 2000s. I looked at it from a reincarnational perspective and souls and all this kind of thing, new agey perspective. And then I began reading what's in the footnotes, and there I got a lot of different information he hadn't put in, and there it completely changed. There I began looking at it, and at the moment that was mentioned that it was a host body, and the host body already had what we call a consciousness principle, then I kind of, that's where all the bells went off in me and say, that's a little bit odd, isn't it? That should have been investigated further. Why was that not investigated further? Because we don't want to believe that as a kind of body snatcher scenario. Why, right? Kind of going into this whole, as Michael Newton talks about, this whole operating room where you see all different lives and you choose which one do you want to be part of as a, excuse my language, fucking tourist on our planet. Which is how I interpret that information, to be honest. Okay, so as in future civilization, having learned to transform the consciousness principle into an orb of energy, and by that can transfer it into different organic vessels, like Time Traveler scenario, as you know, that TV show, right? Transfer from the future back into the past, into a body, as a type of walk-in. That's one possibility. When the owner dies, that's the time travel. They do that there. Or you can merge with the already existing body and live as a parallel symbiotic being that are operating as the quote unquote higher self. Or you could come in via different types of overriding technologies, and by that insert yourself into a form where you then override completely the existing personality matrix and change it all the way through and through, which is what we call a blend or a merge. So there are definitely different possibilities going on here that are much, much more complex and much, much more advanced than what most people normally think about when we talk about what is a human? What does it mean to be awake and aware? What is the expanded perception field? Are we just us in the body? Are there multiple versions of ourselves in the same body, and onward and so forth, without having what we call split personalities or anything that we would call pathological, or in any ways or forms what we call a neurological degrade, dysfunction inside the human brain. Just to put that one into the mix as well. So we definitely have some kind of consciousness principles that enters into the physical form. So whether it is the orb or the transfer or the code stream, or however we're going to work with whatever ideas we can work with from the future, from the past, inside the enclosure, recirculation technologies being pulled out of storage and put into form, being kept in cylinders, which some of the work I've done on the other dimensions, whether it's programs or real, some of these gray operating facilities where you have these plasma vials, where you have the consciousness units in them, which you can then literally pour into that cylinder, that orb of energy, and then they're transferred into the human form, which Michael Newton talks about as well. He's not mentioning grace, but he's definitely talking about the nursery where these orbs are created and how they enter through a tunnel and they get into the physical form. How's that possible from a tunnel into the physical form? How's that connected to the biofield? There are definitely some questions we need to ask ourselves when we talk about reincarnation. And I do suggest you do read Michael Newton's books, because they're really good material. And you get a lot of information there. And Dolores Cannon worked on the same page with a lot of that information too. Very similar in the accounts that she came up with, similar to what was in the Michael Newton's book. Not that she looked him over the shoulder or anything. I think these are two distinct sources that worked with regression and came up with the same kind of information. But they were in the 2000s, so they were under what called the old world order programs. And then we had the huge shift in 2016, so things are working differently now, which is some of the information I got from the Grace. And we here begin to talking about holographic overlays and different forms of technology. So we have also a discernment to be made about the earlier type of technology and the current type of technology that are being used when we talk about bringing consciousness principles or consciousness potentials into this physical form, and by that igniting it and bring it into what we call a living being, and not just a flesh pot or a vessel made of some kind of matter with two eyes that are barely functional and barely doable in anything other than just could be a very advanced type of robot, a very advanced type of clone, or a very advanced type of organic vessel, an operating vessel that only comes to life because it has a consciousness principle in it. If that's not there, then technically it is on the same level of the androids, although the androids are built of a different type of material that allows them to operate in the fourth dimension. But the principle is the same, the functionality is the same. It's an operating vessel to perform certain tasks within a reality field where certain things need to be done. And in that, no need for some kind of higher order consciousness principle. So there's also hierarchy there when we talk about different types of beingness and different type of awareness and different types of functionality. Thank you.